Hello, my name is Shireen Ahmed. I'm a multi-platform sports journalist. I'm a podcaster. I'm also a sports activist, and I am currently a candidate in the Masters of Media Production program at Ryerson University. I found myself in sports through non-traditional means. I didn't go to journalism school, but I was always involved heavily as an athlete, as a coach, as a mentor in sports spaces, particularly to racialized and Muslim young women. And the space that I occupy now is not very different from where I began. It's the same thing. I focus on intersections of racism and misogyny in sport, and I have an expertise in Muslim women in sport as well. And that's what I often write about. My experience in the sport media industry as a racialized woman is probably not different than many other spheres and industries out there. There's obvious challenges, there's benefits. Like, I'm very grateful for the platforms that I have and being able to have access to share, from a different lens. And I'm grateful the conversations happening now in sports media that were unfathomable, maybe even 3 or 4 years ago, because I've been doing this for over a decade. But at the same time, there's structural challenges. And when I say structural, I mean systems of oppression, including racism, misogyny, that exist and are deeply embedded. So at the same time as trying to do the work that I need to do, I'm trying to dismantle those systems. So it's not just one thing. I just don't do work. There's the work, and the content creation and the production side of it and the thinking and collaborating with people, but there's also a very intentional way at which you think about changing the industry you're in. So at the same time as being immersed in it, you want to make it better. So there's a lot of stuff happening, and that's no different from many BIPOC who are in media. I think that some of the things that need to happen on a very basic level is understand that all Muslim women don't have the same experience, and we're not a monolith. And I think that one of the problems is, for example, a very solid example would be when the hijab ban was struck up by FIFA in 2007. There was actually no Muslim women at all consulted, and very little research or scholarship or any information on Muslim women at all. And that particular clothing ban, and what happened was it didn't come from a place where Muslim women were spoken to at all. They were spoken at. And there was presumptions and assumptions made, which were later struck down, which is why the ban itself in 2014 was struck down. But my point is, Muslim women weren't included in the conversations were about them. And although the head covering ban wasn't specifically for Muslim women, it was for Sikh men and for Jewish men who wear kippah, it definitely impacted Muslim women the most. And in France, for example, it still exists. So although all over the world, FIFA has said women can participate in different levels, recreational, semi-pro, pro, whatever. In France, they cannot at any level if they wear a headscarf for political and reasons very much rooted in xenophobia and Islamophobia. So, I mean, having women at the table, and Muslim women in particular, and I'm not saying women that wear hijab have to be at the table. I'm saying different women have to be at the table. And racialized women, particularly Muslim women, have to be at the table. And when you're doing work around a community, not having them there is ridiculous. And in this day and age, would we think about it? But this happened not very long ago. It happened in 2007. And that's one of the things. The biggest challenge very often, other than confidence for young Muslim women to gain entry into sport, is always uniform accommodation and lack thereof. And it's even more so than financial restraint, is lack of uniform accommodation and what that looks like. And it's not difficult, whether you contact a company such as Capsters or maybe even Nike Hijab are open to this now, to incorporate that into like a school uniform, which I know some schools in the GT have already started doing, and in New England have done as well. And they incorporate that in. So there's options, because the most important thing to remember here is alternatives are required and options are necessary. And forcing someone out of clothing is as violent as forcing them into it. And I think it's really important to understand that women should have choice to safely participate. I understand why there are rules about jewelry for safety reasons, but there is no empirical data or proof anywhere in the world, I know because I spent 10 years looking for it, that hijabs are actually dangerous in sport. That's not a thing. So within the parameters of safety and regulations of the sport, women should be able to compete safely with prototypes of sports hijabs that are now being created all the time. As centering the athletes, for sure, we've seen, and WSL has a Black Players Coalition, the WNBA has a Social Justice Coalition. And I think this is really important, that I don't want the work to solely be on racialized athletes, but we know in anti-oppression spaces, that's exactly what happens. Racialized folks pick up and carry, they don't pick up, they've always carried the mantle. So what I need now is less of talking about how it's important to other people to start unlearning. I'm past that. Like we're far past that. I need people to stop being, I even need people to stop thinking about allyship. I need them to be accomplices and collaborators in the process in anti-oppression. I'm far beyond the allyship conversation. I don't think it's sufficient. And it's different than what I felt a year ago, most definitely. But after a year of being fully immersed in spaces and conversations in my own industry, we could talk for 100 years about allyship and what it means to different people. And I'm sorry, I don't have that time. I don't have time for shenanigans. Let's get going. Let's move forward with momentum. I think it's the understanding of feminism and what it is. If you don't have conversations about ableism, about gender identity and expansive gender identity, or race, it's not feminism. So those things are not, they're not diametrically opposed, and they should never be. So for me, what feminism is intersectional and inherently includes those things. So if you come at me and are like, we want to be diverse, here's 3 women on a panel with a white man, like 3 white women. That's, I've said this before, 3 white women on a panel is a country club lunch. That's what that is. It's not a diversity panel. So I'm not interested in that. That doesn't represent me. And we're in a place where, unfortunately, post-second wave feminism, that white women have started speaking for all women when they lack the experience, the understanding, the lived experience to speak for many others. And acknowledging one's privilege, like even me and my privilege, educational status, whatever, linguistic, definitely immigration privilege. I can't speak for other people. I speak for me. I research other people and they share their stories with me. And I do that journalistically and as a researcher. But I have to be very careful where I stand and be very clear on that. And I think that feminism has lacked that. Women feel that, there is a unifying process here just because simply they identify as women, when in fact, white women have proven to be very dangerous, particularly about trans girls and trans women. And we see in sports spaces, there is a literal attack on trans bodies and trans youth in the United States. And that is being led by white women at the forefront. And another piece that I mentioned earlier, the ban for hijab that still exists in France is also being led by white women. So we have to understand this, and that I'm not interested in a feminism that is exclusionary. Unconditional inclusion is what I'm interested in. Hijabi Ballers has been an absolutely wonderful organization that has managed to manifest a lot of energy. I think growing it in itself is up to the organization, most definitely. And I, was on the advisory board for a really long time, since their inception, actually. But also having people write about them and having programs to perhaps facilitate some of the young participants into going into media and storytelling as well. Like I will always be a proponent of very much expanding the landscape of media and sports media in particular, because I believe that who tells the story is as important as the story itself. And I'll always feel that way, because lived experience is something that can't be just calibrated or learned. It is something that exists. It's there, it's not. And the more variety we have in sharing stories about this and perspectives, the richer sports media can be. And, this binary of having white sports media talking about racialized athletes is not it. It's not good enough. And I want more as somebody who loves sports and consumes sports and lives in that world. So a place like Hijabi Ballers could definitely foster that. And they're doing a lot of really great things. They're not only focusing on playing aspect, they're talking about fandom aspect. They're talking about, they influenced the making of the first a pro team sports job through the Raptors, which was an amazing collaboration. And, I remember seeing that and completely feeling overwhelmed, because it was the first time I saw sports teams say, hey, we see you. We see that you're in that community. And they did that. So undoubtedly, they use social media and community engagement to prove not even to prove, to establish themselves so deeply, to say we've always been here. And I think that's important. So, watching them grow and supporting them as they need, but also their organization has to grow structurally, and supporting them in whatever means that is. Accountability needs to change, and like just in general, and how that is approached. You have people in power who walk away with impunity, whether it's sexualized violence, whether it's abuse that we've seen marred in so many places. The word accountability is used so flippantly and casually, when it really, accountability means to stand up and acknowledge harm, and in harm reduction practices, as you move forward, to acknowledge what has been done and do the work to make sure it doesn't happen again. Yet in sports spaces, we constantly see maltreatment and abuse, not just of high performance athletes, but of so many people, recreation. And we see constant, stories being shared of racialized abuse against kids in hockey. Like, where's the accountability there? And it's one thing to use up a sport to say, well, it's not the sport that's the problem, and this is actually really great. The sport is not the problem, it's the culture around the problem. And when you take ownership of that, be it a federation, be it a local league, be it a parent representative, to say, I'm going to take this and I'm going to do my best to change it. People are always very concerned, and I find this, people with the most privilege, and I'll qualify that because in sports in Canada, it's white people, are reluctant to do that for fear of being called out or doing it wrong. Get past yourself, decenter yourself in the accountability process, and that's how you can move forward. And that's how you can make, you take actionable steps towards sustainable change in these things. And whatever the type of violence is, and racism is a form of violence, exclusion is a form of violence, all of this is truly part of white supremacy. Take hold of that and know where you stand, and then think about going forward in a meaningful and sincere way. Because the one thing that is opposite to accountability at times is authenticity and sincerity, and we need that, and honesty. Like, where's the transparency? Where are the people? Who is speaking out, and who is literally saying, I will take the reins of this, and I will go with it? We lack that. There's a clear part of integrity that's missing with accountability. So accountability, diversity, inclusion are really interesting words that are thrown around, like DEI work and consultancy. And I think that I want to be really careful. I had a Twitter thread not too long ago that I was just like, I'm not going to use the word diversity anymore. I'm a scribe at heart, and words are really important to me. And diversity, like I mentioned it a little before, like, what does it mean? Instead of just using diversity, I want to say racial inclusion. I want to say racial equity. I want to say racial justice. I want to say gender expansiveness. I want to use terms that are very deliberate. And when we get caught up in words, that's exactly what happens. We get caught up in words, and we get lost in the debate and the discussion. So the work gets left behind, and we're still theorizing. I'm done theorizing. Let's get on the ground. And I talked about accountability and what that looks like, and accountability in terms of, and I think there's a disconnect between what people who have suffered under systems of white supremacy or oppression in sport, they're not asking for everything to necessarily shut down. I realize I'm part of a podcast called Burn It All Down, but what I mean is that to take the current system that exists, to get some accountability within that, but keep moving forward. It's not an attempt to halt everything, because that's just doesn't exist, particularly in a capitalist model. But you have to acknowledge that hurt, those issues, those challenges, think strategically as you keep moving. So you have to work within what you have and continue to go forward. And inclusion is very simple. I said it before, I'll say it again: unconditional inclusion. I refuse to believe that there's spaces where we shouldn't have this, and women's sports is being endangered. And I said it before, and I'll say it again: trans youth will not disproportionately negatively affect girls' sports. And people who say that to you are lying. That is a form of transphobia, and it's part of white supremacy as well. It's literally under that umbrella, because transphobia is not very far away from homophobia, which is not very far away from racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and all those evils. They're connected. So they're so connected to each other. So I mean, I just want to be really clear about that I'm not interested in the rhetoric about who should be included, because I'm sorry, the goalposts don't get to shift. I think one of the things that I'd really like to say about accountability in this whole piece is really important, because accountability is not a conversation that's had for a longer period of time, other than just you'll see a quick panel on accountability and what that looks like. But does that mean legally? Does that mean culture wise? Uh, does that mean reconciliation for stuff that has happened before, or reckoning with? And accountability moves because at the same time, sports is so dynamic and sports media is so dynamic that it keeps moving. So we have to address what has happened in a meaningful way, that those that were impacted negatively get a sense of, okay, we can do this and move forward. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we are moving forward in a way that's sustainable and that's practical and that is inclusive. So this conversation on accountability is also not over. It's ongoing and it's dynamic. And we have to keep revisiting things that aren't set. Like, are we looking at policy changes? Are we looking at statements? Are we looking at inclusion practices? Are we looking at, anti-Blackness eradication? Are we looking at, anti-indigeneity and what that looks like? Are we having policies to help, children and youth and women who are struggling with financial issues? Can we have something that weaves them in? Like the pay to play model for sports in this country is difficult. I mean, even access to programs in sports media or access to this industry is very limited. It's a network industry. What does that look like? Are we creating space for other people? And when I say creating space, the space is already there. It's just a matter, like, I don't want marginalized folks to keep getting caught in the cycle where we think we have to fight over scraps for stuff, because that's not a thing. There's more than enough room here for everybody. And I mean that in sport, but I think there needs to be leadership, and leadership not just in the media, but at every levels, and racialized leadership at many different levels. There needs to be more women in decision-making roles, most definitely. Very recently, like just a couple of days ago, TSN had an all-women's broadcast, the first of the NBA. That is huge, but I mean, we still are women, not in the month of March. We're women in April, we're women in November. Like Black History Month, Black folks are still Black, not just in February. Pride Month is June, but people still are gay in December. So let's keep doing that work, but also you weave in. We at Burn It All Down didn't specifically do something for Black History Month because we have that interwoven into our content all the time anyway. It's not a tokenizing thing. It's not a reduction thing, but it's literally to say this is how and what it can look like all the time. That's what accountability is. Look at what you're doing. Look at what you're putting out in the world. How do you make it stronger? How do you make it better? And how do you make it more inclusive of a lot of other people? And I mean, that's the note that I just have to go up for. Look at what you're doing and what you can do. And I mean, I'm not saying this to be cynical, but what you're doing isn't enough. You can always do more. We can all do more. And you'll make mistakes. This won't happen overnight. It's a structural inequality. It's not something that can be rectified in 4 quarters. It's going to take time. We're like in quadruple overtime if we're talking about sports metaphors, and we're going to keep going. It's literally a marathon, not a sprint. So keep doing the work and think about where you are in that space.